Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to section 3, which is Tajweed and lesson 7. Today we're going to talk about Tafkheem and Tarqeeq. Let's get into it. On the agenda today, we're going to do a review of the previous lesson. I'm going to ask you, as usual, to do the warm ups, and then we're going to go into letter collections we've been memorizing. And finally, we're going to have not finally, exercises are going to be final. Tafkheem and Tarqiq is going to be the meat of today's presentation, and then we're going to end with some exercises that I'm going to recommend for you, and that should take us to the end. As a review, what we talked about last time was the rules of starting and stopping, and these rules aren't necessarily rules in the sense that they are guidelines for beginners. Um, if you go to any advanced readers, they'll tell you that these aren't necessarily rules, but I curated these with beginners in mind. So if you follow these rules, I just wanted to make sure that if you have a specific set of rules, that if you follow them, your recitation will be correct. So rule number 1, that if you stop in the middle of a verse for any reason, whether you ran out of breath or you want to start reciting, just go ahead and read back from 2 to 3 words where you stopped reciting. So if it's a long verse and you had to stop in the middle because you ran out of breath, then just start reading like 2 or 3 words back from where you stopped reading. Rule number 2, if the word that you stop at has any voweled diacritic or any tanween except fathataan, meaning if it has damma, fatha, kasra, or tanween tanween al-dhamm, tanween al-kasr, then you will treat that last letter of the last word that you stopped on as if it has a sukoon on it. Rule number 3, if the last letter of the last word that you stopped on has fathatan, then what you're going to turn those fathatan into, you're going to add a fatha and an alif. You're going to turn those fathatan into a fatha and an alif. Rule number 4 is that if the word ends with the ta marboota, regardless of whether the ta marboota has fathatan on it or not, the ta marboota will turn into a ha. So even if the ta marboota has fathatan on it, you are still going to, if you are stopping and the last letter of the last word that you stopped on has a ta marboota, then the ta marboota turns into a ha, regardless of what diacritic is on that ta marboota. This is in contrast with rule number 3. Rule number 5, if the word ends with a mad or madd-ul-leen as the last syllable of that word, you can extend that mad to 2 or 4 or 6 counts. But during a recitation session, you should keep that consistent. Meaning, if you start a recitation session and you are completing your mud for 4 counts, then for the rest of the session, to complete all your mudud, whether it be madd-ul-leen as the last syllable or the natural mud as the last syllable, then you're going to do 4 counts on all of them. If you did 6 counts first time, do 6 counts. Just remain consistent. Rule number 6 is the Hamzatul wasl rules. A lot of rules here, so let's let's assume for argument's sake, Hamzatul wasl occurs at the beginning of the definite article. Then definitely the Hamzatul wasl gets a fatha. That's easy when you're starting. This is the rule of starting when you're starting with the Hamzatul wasl. If it's a definite article, then the Hamza get a fatha and Hamza fatha lam sukoon al. That's pretty easy to remember. But if the first voweled letter is a damma, meaning you started with a word and the first letter is a Hamzatul wasl, the second or third is basically you have to look at the second letter. If the first vowel letter that happens to occur after Hamzatul wasl has a damma, then the Hamzatul wasl gets a damma. Otherwise, the Hamzatul wasl gets a kasra. There are exceptions to this, which are below. These are the words that are always pronounced with a kasra on the Hamzatul wasl, regardless of how and when they're occurring. So these are, and basically these are exceptions to the rules that you read above. Imshu, iqbu, itu, imdu, ismuhu, and imru, and ibnu. These are the words that are always read with a kasra, regardless of what's on the third letter. So this is an exception to the rules that we just mentioned about Hamzatul wasl. But I did not find any instance of these occurring at the start of a verse. So if you connect the previous word, meaning you are reciting and you continue to recite, and you happen to come across one of these words, because this word is going to connect with the previous word, the Hamzatul wasl will get cancelled, and you won't have to worry about the starting with the Hamzatul wasl on any of these, because none of these occur at the beginning of verses. So as long as you connect the previous word, you will skip the Hamzatul wasl, and you won't have to remember this exception in this bullet point. That was our review. And on to the warm-ups. As usual, I'm going to ask you to do your warm-ups. Please watch the warm-ups video. I'll provide a link in the video. I'll probably tag it in this video as well. Please do not skip. And today, I believe it's warm-up number 14. Please pay especially close attention to warm-up number 14, which is la 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 versus li li li, and the ra 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 versus ri 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 warm-up. Very important. Don't skip. As usual, we're going to refresh our letter collections that we've been memorizing. The first letter collection that we've been memorizing are the throat letters, or letters of Izhar. These are 6 letters, and they are Hamza, Ha, Ain, Ha, Ghain, Kha. The next is the lip letters, and those are the ones that the primary articulation point is the lips. And those are Fa, Waw, Ba, and Mim. Next, we have the Tafkhim letters, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Very important. These are the letters that are always pronounced heavy, and you have to memorize these. These are pronounced as if you have a mouthful of food, or as if you sound like an opera singer. And those are Sad, Dad, Ba, Va, Ghain, Kha, and Qaf. Those are the letters of Tafkhim. And you have to memorize these, and we're going to talk about the details of this today. Next, we have Idgham letters. Those are the letters that we talked about in Ahkam al-Nun al-Sakina wa tanween and the Idgham rules. Idgham bi-ghunna, Idgham bi-ghayr ghunna. You can go watch that video. It's in my channel. But we've been memorizing the Idgham letters, and those are as follows. Those are Yarmalun, or Ya, Ra, Mim, Lam, Waw, and Nun, Yarmalun. The mud letters are those that, when connected, cause elongation, and those are 3 letters, and they're alif, waw, and ya. Alif, waw, and ya. Those are the mud letters. Then we have the qalqala letters. These are the letters that, when they have a sukoon on them, you have to bounce or echo the sound a little bit. Those are called the qalqala letters, and you can remember these by jad qutub or qutub jad, and they are Qaf, Ta, Ba, Jim, Dal. Qaf, Ta, Ba, Jim, Dal, or Jad Qutub or Qutub Jad. That's a quick memorization technique for you. Jad Qutub or Qutub Jad for the Qalqala letters. Okay, on to today's lesson. Tafkheem and Tarqeeq. Tafkhim is an Arabic word that means emphasizing or giving importance or making important. The context of tajweed, it refers to the intensification or pronunciation of a letter intensely when you pronounce it. In contrast, doing tarqiq is the opposite, which means to make it soft or lightening something. And that's another characteristic. When certain letters are pronounced, they are pronounced heavy, they're pronounced mufakham or with tafkhim, and certain letters are pronounced muraqqaq or pronounced with tarqiq. And as I mentioned, warm up number 14, we've been doing la 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 versus li li li, ra 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 versus ri ri ri. That's a warm up that will help you differentiate, understand, and know, and basically remember the difference. Why, certain sounds of certain letters are heavy and light. Now, tafkhim and tarqiq are not a beginner topic. There's a lot to cover here, and I can't possibly cover it with, the level of detail that it deserves without confusing beginners. but I have created this video with beginners in mind. So everything that you're going to see from now on is curated with beginners in mind. So, on to the details of Tafkhim and Tarqiq. This characteristic of Tafkhim or Tarqiq, meaning like making heavy or making light, divides the Arabic letters into three categories. If a letter is always pronounced heavy, that's in the first category. If a letter is sometimes pronounced heavy and sometimes pronounced light, and those conditions we're going to talk about today, it's in the second category. And those letters that are always light are in the third category. So there are some letters that are always pronounced heavy, some letters that are conditionally pronounced heavy or light, and some letters that are always pronounced light. And those are the three category of letters. And we're going to talk about those today. There are 7 letters of Tafkhim, and these are the letters that are always pronounced heavy. And that's one characteristic of these letters that they always have. There is no exception to this, and those are Sad, Dad, Ta, Va, Ghain, Kha, and Qaf. Notice how I'm pronouncing them. If you can hear me over the audio properly, I am pronouncing them as if I'm an opera singer. Sad, Dad, Ta, Va. I'm slightly over exaggerating the pronunciation so that the microphone picks it up, but you will notice that I'm making the pronunciation of these letters heavy, as if my mouth is full of food or as if I'm an opera singer. There are 3 letters that are sometimes pronounced heavy and sometimes light, and those are Ra, Lam, and Alif. This is the second category. The conditions of when that happens we're going to talk about in just a second and today. But there is another sound that is conditionally pronounced heavy or light, which is the ghunna sound. And this ghunna is sometimes pronounced heavy or sometimes pronounced light. We will talk about the details of this as well. But the ghunna is not a letter, right? The ghunna is just a sound. When is the ghunna pronounced heavy or light? We'll talk about today as well. And the rest of the letters are always pronounced light, meaning they have tarqiq. So the top ones are always tafkhim. The middle ones are sometimes tafkhim and light, which is the 3 letters and the ghunna sound. And then finally, the last category is always pronounced light or with tarqiq. I expect you to remember and memorize the top line, which is fa, ba, ba, wa, ghain, kha, and qaf. We've been memorizing them. I also expect you to remember those that are pronounced conditionally light or heavy, but I don't expect you to remember the third category. Those, basically think of it, those you just say the top 7 plus the middle 3. If you subtract those, the rest of them are always going to be light. So that should be easy enough to remember. But I do expect you to remember the first and second categories, which is the letters of Tafkhim. I definitely expect you to remember those. And the letters that are conditionally pronounced light or heavy, I definitely expect you to remember those as well. First, we're going to talk about the letter Sad. Aqimus Salah. Aqimus Salah. This Sad is pronounced heavy, and I'm going to pick a little bit today on my Indo-Pak brothers and sisters. They seem to have trouble with Sad because in the Urdu language, I don't know that much about Hindi, but definitely in Urdu, Sad and Sin and Tha, even though there are 3 distinct letters, and in Arabic, those 3 distinct letters have 3 distinct articulations, points, and pronunciations. They have completely different sounds. In Urdu, they sound almost identical. Practically nobody in Urdu, differentiates them. So I hear a lot of my Pakistani brothers use this word as salah. This is not salah. This is not a sin. This is not salah. This is salah. Not salah, salah. The sad is heavy. So. This word is an example of the wad is yudaf. Yudaf. Another word that's somewhat difficult for my Indo-Pak brothers to pronounce. Third is tayran. Ta. This ta fathaya sukoon tay is another example. This ta is pronounced by my Indo-Pak brothers as identical almost to the letter ta. The letter ta is heavy. The letter ta is light. If this was pronounced with the letter ta, this would sound like tayran, tayran. But this is not tayran. This word is tayran, tayran. Notice how heavy and full of, like, my mouth full it sounds like when I'm pronouncing this letter ba. This is tayran. This is not tayran. This is tayran. Another example of a letter that some of my Indo-Pak brothers have trouble with is volama, volama, because this letter and dal and za, they pronounced nearly identical, but this is not zalama. This is not zalama. This is volama, volama. Zalama is incorrect. Volama is correct. This va is heavy. Next we have غيري, غير, غين. Next we have خالدين, خا. This kha is pronounced very heavy. And finally, another letter that my Indo-Pak brothers have trouble with is qaf. And this is qadir, not qadir. Is incorrect to say qadir. This is not qadir. This is qadir, qadir. This qaf has to be pronounced heavy. I hope that's clear. Within the levels of Tafkhim, how heavy you should pronounce stuff, there are two schools of thoughts. The first school says that there are three levels of Tafkhim, while the second school says that there are five levels of Tafkhim. Both are correct, but I'm going to teach you that the three levels, um, because it's easier for beginners. And the three levels in the first school of thought is that the strongest tafkhim is of the letter when the letter of tafkhim has a fatha, or the letter of tafkhim has a sukoon, but there's a fatha on the letter before it. That's when the tafkhim, or the intensification of the letter, is highest or strongest. The second level is when the tafkhim letter itself has a damma, or the letter of tafkhim has a sukoon on it, but the letter before it has a damma. Then this would be the second level, and the third and final level would be the letter of tafkhim. One of the seven letters of tafkhim has a kasra below it, or the letter itself has a sukoon, but the letter before it has a kasra. Now, this distinction is subtle enough that I'm not able to properly demonstrate it. No matter how hard I tried, trying to sound it out in audio, I wasn't able to do it. So, what I would recommend you do is find a teacher or find someone at your local masjid, have them listen and pronounce to them, and they can, give you the details of this one. It's very difficult for me, like, even with like the advanced audio tools and like the audio capture was not that good on this video for me to be able to differentiate for you. I'll try to do my best with these examples, but I doubt that it will come through in the audio. But let's see. This word is ظلامة, ظلامة. This wa fatha is at the highest level of tafkhim because this is a tafkhim letter with a fatha on top. This is al-maghdubi, al-maghdubi. This is the second level. This is a medium level tafkhim because the bod has a dhamma. And finally, this sad has a kasra below it. This is sirata, sirata. And this is the lowest and the third level of tafkhim. Now, if you go back and you listen to my video again, you'll probably maybe a little bit hear the level of tafkhim differentiation that I'm doing. But other than like recommending you go recite to someone, I'm afraid I won't be able to demonstrate this for you in a YouTube video. You're just gonna have to, find a teacher and recite to them. We have talked about the tafkhim letters and the levels of tafkhim, and now we are on to the letters that have conditional. There are certain letters in the Arabic language, including lam, alif, and ra, that are conditionally pronounced heavy or light. And the first letter we're going to talk about is the letter lam. All the lam in the Quran are pronounced light, except when we are using the lam in the name of Allah or the lafzul jalala. Whenever the lafzul jalala occurs and it is preceded by fatha damma, or if you're pronouncing with the laf, or you're starting from the lafzul jalala being Allah, when the either the letter combining with the lam shadda of Allah is combined, and that combined letter, letter that is being combined with, has a fatha or a dhamma, or when you are starting from the lafzul jalala because it happens to occur at the beginning of a verse, then the lafzul jalala will be pronounced heavy. Otherwise, the lam in the lafzul jalala will be pronounced light. And I'll give you some examples of this. The first example is when we're going to pronounce this light. Notice this ba kasra and lam shadda is going to connect. We're going to say amanna billahi. This word is billahi, billahi, because this ba kasra and lam shadda are connected, and this lam in the lafzul jalala is being connected to a maksura letter, which is ba kasra, then this lam is going to be pronounced light. We're going to say billahi. In contrast, this next example is the letter when the lam shadda is actually being connected to a maftuha noon fatha lam shadda nal. So the word we're going to say this is yukhadi'un Allah. So I'm going to pronounce for you this and this separately. I'm going to say this lam in billah is light, and this lam in nallah is heavy. Billah versus nallah. Billah versus nallah. Allah versus law. Billah versus nallah. I hope you're hearing the differentiation. This is very light, the lam is light, this lam is very heavy. Now this lam, because, or this lafzul jalala, because it's occurring at the beginning of a verse, is pronounced heavy because we're starting from the Hamzatul wasl, and this is Allah, and that is heavy. So this is Allah. This lam is, and because of this ba kasra, is pronounced light, and this lam, because of this noon fatha, is pronounced heavy. I hope you are hearing the difference. I want you to go back and rewind the video if you are having difficulty hearing. Here is a quick chart for you. You can use this as a guide for yourself, and this can be a guide in letting you know how to pronounce lafzul jalala, whether and when it's heavy or light. All right, on to the letter ra. We did the conditionals on the letter lam. Next is the letter ra. Letter ra has a lot of complicated rules. We were going to go over all the exceptions, etc. And at the end of the rulings on the letter ra, I'll give you the golden rule. And that golden rule should get you through like 85% of the Quran. Most of the letters in the Quran, the letter ra, it follows that golden rule. So if you just follow that rule, you will be okay. But as we are delving deep, we do need to discover all the details. So let's get into it. The tarqiq of the letter ra is according to the rules that you see below. Meaning, the following is the situations when the letter ra is pronounced light, muraqqaq. And the first situation is when it has a kasra or kasratan below it. For example, sudurin nas. This is rin nas, sudurin nas. That's the example that you see right there. Next example, and the next case when the ra is pronounced light, is when the ra itself is sakin, but the letter before it has a kasra. So for example, you have فرعون, fa kasra ra sukun, fir. This is fir, fir. This ra is pronounced light. The next rule, when the ra is pronounced light, is the letter ra itself is sakin and the letter before it is sakin, but the third letter before has a kasra. In this case, we're stopping on the ra kasratan. These kasratan, because we're stopping, they turn into a ra sukoon. So this is hijrin, but because we're stopping, this will become ra sukoon. So this will become hijr. Because we're stopping, this ra becomes sakin. We look at the letter before. The jim is also sakin. We look at the letter before. The third letter before has a kasra. Therefore, this ra is pronounced light. This is hijr. The next letter or the next rule for tarqiq is when the ra sukoon is preceded by a ya sakin. So, for example, this is al khair, al khair. Now, we're not saying al khairi because we're stopping at this, so we're just treating the ra as sakin. The word is al khair, but this rule is an exception. This is not the general rule. This is an exception to a rule that you will learn shortly. Just remember that if you see ya sukun right before the letter ra, right, then you're supposed to pronounce the ra light or with tarqiq. Just remember that was an exception. Now we are on to the tafkhim rules of the letter ra. These are all related to the ones that you see on your screen, are fatha, fathatan. When the ra itself has a fatha or fathatan on it, then the ra will be pronounced with tafkhim. This example is mutahhara. The second example that you see on your screen is when the ra is sakin. When the ra is sakin, but the letter before it has a fatha. This is al-ardi. Al. Now, because the ra has a sukoon, but the letter before it has a fatha, this sakin ra will be pronounced heavy. This is ra, al. And this is the third example. And the ra is sakin, and the letter before it is sakin, but we're going to have to look at the third letter. And the third letter before has a fatha. So now, even though this ra has a kasra, because we're stopping because of the ending of the verse, we're going to treat this ra as a sakin ra. So this is ra sukoon. Right before it, we see the slad sukoon. And right before that, we see na'in fatha. Because of this maftuha letter, this third ra, or the third letter before this ra sakin will become heavy, or with tafkhim. So this is wal asr. We're going to pronounce this ra heavy. Wal asr. If we continued, and you must have heard plenty of reciters doing this, wal asri innal, because we continued, did not stop on this ra. This no longer is a ra sukoon. This is a ra maksura. And because ra has a kasra below it, and we remember the rule of tarqiq, a ra kasra is always pronounced light. But in this case, because we're stopping of this ending verse mark, and this ra sukoon, and because right before the ra sukoon, this is sad sukoon, and then we look at the third letter, because this maksura ra turned into a ra sukoon, and this sad sukoon, we look at the third letter as a fatha, so that we do tafkhim on it. Now you have to pronounce or contrast, this rule with the rule that you learned previously. And which rule was that? Which is this rule, al khair. That ra comes with the sukoon and preceded by this last, the one that you see on your screen. The last on this slide, the tarqiq slide, when the ra comes with the sukoon and is preceded by as a ya sakin, then it is going to be pronounced lightly. Now notice that even though the third letter before this ra sukoon, because we stopped here, so this is a ra sukoon, this is a ya sukoon, and this is kha fatha. But notice this is the exception, whereas this is the rule. This is the exception. The last uh, rule that you see on your screen, al khair. The rule is that when the letter has a fatha, so when the ra is sukoon, letter before it has a sukoon, the third letter before it has a fatha, then the ra will be pronounced heavy. This is the exception. That even though this kha fatha has a fatha on it, and the third letter before the ra sukoon, so we look at the ra, it's sakin. We look at the ya, it's sakin. The third letter before has a fatha, but because of the ya sukoon, we pronounce this heavy. This is khair. I'm sorry, not heavy, light. Tarqiq, not tafkhim, tarqiq. Khair, this ra is going to be pronounced light. The general rule is that when you are doing sukoon on a ra and the letter before it has a sukoon, but the third letter before has a fatha, then it will be pronounced heavy. This is the rule. Wal asr, the ra is pronounced heavy. This is the exception. Al khair, ra is pronounced light in this case. So that is the rule and that is the exception. Next we have the rules with damma and dammatan. When ra has a damma on it or dammatan, then the ra is going to be pronounced with tafkhim. يتفجر منه يتفجر. This ra damma is going to be heavy. This ra damma is going to be heavy. Next we have when the ra is sakin, but the letter before it has a damma. So this is qaf, dhamma, ra sukun, qur. This ra is going to be pronounced heavy. Quran. And the third and final rule with dhamma and dhammatan is when the ra itself is sakin, the letter before it is sakin, but the third letter before has a dhamma. Then the ra is going to be heavy as well. Tafkhim. So if we stop on this word, al-usr, and because we're stopping it, this ra fatha becomes a ra sukun. Because this comes out on sukoon, we look at the letter before. That is also sakin, we look at the third letter before. That's a dhamma, and because of this dhamma, this ra sukoon will be pronounced heavy or with tafkhim. The final set of rules with tafkhim is that when the ra sukoon is preceded by hamzatul wasl, right before ra sukoon is preceded by hamzatul wasl, and we talked about the hamzatul wasl in the rules related to starting and stopping quite a bit. When the hamzatul wasl is before the ra sukun, then the pronouncement of the ra sukun will be heavy, even if the letter before has a kasra. What do I mean? For example, in this case, irji'i, irji'i, this ra is going to be pronounced heavy. If you remember the rules, when we're starting with hamzatul wasl, and when we're starting with hamzatul wasl, we look at the third letter to see what letter the hamzatul wasl gets. In this case, because of this jim kasra, this hamzatul wasl gets a kasra. But this hamzatul wasl gets a kasra, and this ra sukun is immediately after this hamzatul wasl. Now there's a conflict. What's the conflict? This hamzatul wasl gets a kasra, and we learned that a ra sukun and the letter before the ra sukun is kasra, then technically that should be a light pronunciation, tarqiq. But this is not the case. This is an exception. This is an exception to that rule. Irji'i, in this case, even though this hamzatul wasl is pronounced with a kasra, this ra sukun is going to be pronounced heavy. Hamzatul wasl causes this ra sukun to be heavy. Irji'i. This is irji'i. Next, we have another exception to the general rule. The general rule being that the letter before the ra sukun, if it has a kasra, then the ra is generally pronounced light. But in this case, these two are the cases where it's pronounced heavy. If the letter immediately following the ra sukun is one of the letters of tafkhim, we remembered the letters of tafkhim, right? In this case, this is ra sukun, but immediately following qirtas, immediately following ra, the letter is ta fatha, and that ta fatha, ta is one of the letters of tafkhim. And because of that, even though this ra sukun, the letter immediately before it has a kasra, the qaf has a kasra, technically the general rule should be then, well, this ra should be pronounced light because of this kasra. But that's not the case here. This is the exception. The exception is that if immediately after the ra sukoon occurs one of the letters of tafkhim, in this case, the letter of tafkhim that occurs is ta, then the ra sukoon must be pronounced heavy, even if the letter before the ra sukoon happens to be a maksura letter, which is the case here. This is qiltas. You have to contrast these rules with the two rules that you see on your screen with the two previously learned rules, which is a sakin ra with a kasra before it. The sakin ra with the kasra before it, you pronounce them light. A sakin ra with a kasra before it, you pronounce it light. These two are exceptions, even though this ra sukoon has a kasra before it and this ra sukoon has a kasra before it. Both these ra sukoons are going to be pronounced heavy. This one because of the hamzatul wasl, this one because immediately after this ra sukoon is one of the letters of tafkhim. So these are the exceptions, all the rules of the letters of the ra and all of the exceptions. But it becomes difficult, and I agree. If you want to perfect your recitation, you're going to need to learn all of these rules. But if the ra has one of these, what I wanted you to have is the golden rule. Which, with this golden rule, if you just follow this golden rule, pretty much covers like 85 to 90% of the ra's in the Quran. And the golden rule goes as follows: that if the ra has any of these three diacritics, there is no exception. Meaning, you are reciting and you are not stopping in the ra, because if you're stopping, then obviously the fatha damma kasra will turn into a sukoon. But if you continue reciting, then, well, the letter ra might have one of these three diacritics, which is fatha damma or kasra. And if that happens, then there are no exceptions in the ra. Ra maftuha and ra madmuma is always heavy, and ra maksura is always light. Meaning, if you see a diacritic above the ra, it's heavy. If you see a diacritic below the ra, it is light. If you see fatha damma on top of the ra, it is heavy. If you see a kasra below the ra, it is light. And this is always the case. What we just discussed were a bunch of exceptions, right? And those exceptions can be hard to remember. So if you just follow this golden rule, you remember this golden rule, you follow this golden rule, 85% of the laws in the Quran you're covered on. It is when you get to that last 15% and beautification of your recitation, that's when you have to remember and memorize those exceptions to the rule. Right? So don't worry, we're going to assign you exercises for all of this, but you just have to remember as a beginner this exceptional or the golden rule of the letter ra. Next, we have elongation. Remember, we talked about the three conditional letters, right? We talked about the letter lam, we talked about the letter ra. Now we're on to the third conditional letter, which is the letter alif. And this happens when you elongate with the alif. Meaning when you are doing a mad or elongating with the letter alif, the elongation takes the heavy or light characteristic that happens to be attached to the elongation. So for example, the two examples that you see on your screen is ضَالًّا. And the second example that you see on your screen is عَائِلًا. Now this, I held the ضاد fatha alif mad, lam shadda, ضال. Now this elongation is going to be held for 6 counts, and during those 6 counts, I'm going to hold that elongation with a full mouth. I'm going to say, oh, this is ضالًا. For this one, عائلا, I'm going to hold this elongation for 4 counts, but while I'm holding this elongation, I'm going to pronounce this elongation light. Why? Because ayn is one of the letters of Tarqiq, whereas dad is one of the letters of Tafkhim. Therefore, This elongation is going to be pronounced with the characteristic of the attached letter. Bo, and this is o versus o versus a. I hope you're hearing the difference. I want to ask you a question. What happens when it is lafzul jalala? Right? In lafzul jalala, sometimes when we're ending or we're starting or we're pausing, the lafzul jalala gets a mad. Now Allah, when we're finishing, and because we're finishing, then that elongation will also become conditional, right? If it so happens that we are on lafzul jalala and we're ending with the verse, and it happens to be at the end of the verse, and we're elongating it to 4 counts or 6 counts, however long you want to elongate it, it's up to you. Then that lam, because the conditional tafkhim or tarqiq of the lam, if you're elongating that tafkhim or tarqiq, then that 6 counts is going to be held with that conditional characteristic. If it so happens that it's a light lam on the lafz jalala, then you are going to hold it for 6 counts lightly. Lillah. But if you're holding it for 6 counts and it's heavy, then you're going to hold all 6 counts heavy. Allah. So I hope you are hearing the difference. Let's move on. Next we have ghunna. This is not a letter, but it is a sound that you make when you are making ikhfa on the noon or mim. You can learn the rules of ikhfa related to noon sakin or mim sakin. That's on the channel as well. And the letter immediately after, when you are making this ikhfa on mim or noon sakin, if the letter is immediately after happens to be one of these listed letters, which is sa, ba, ta, and qaf, then the nasalization is going to be heavy. Remember, we're holding the nasalization in our nose a little bit. It's not technically an elongation, it's nasalization, but we have to hold that gunna, that nasalization in our nose a little bit. And when we're holding it, we're going to hold that nasalization with the characteristic of the letter that is immediately after that nasalization. So it so happens that this nasalization, fathataan, immediately after it happens to be off, which is one of these letters, right? The one of the 5 letters that you see on your screen. And therefore, this nasalization is going to be heavy. So therefore, this nasalization is going to be fathataan qalu. I'm not saying fathataan. I'm not hiding that nasalization. I'm making that nasalization as if it's my mouth is full. You fathataan qalu. I'm doing that so that it's easier for me to pronounce immediately, add the letter immediately after. Same thing here. I'm doing ikhfa on this noon sukoon. This is yunsarun. This yun, I'm holding this noon in my nose, but immediately after is one of the letters of one of the 5 letters that you see on your screen. Therefore, that ghunna is going to be held in my nose heavy. Min teen, mandud. Notice how I'm pronouncing that noon and that ikhfa on the noon. It's the same case when you're doing ikhfa on the noon or the mim sakin when you're nasalizing, or that nasalization sound when you're holding it in your nose. If it happens to be that such that one of the letters that you see on your screen, the 5 letters, is immediately after that nasalization, then you hold that nasalization heavy. Otherwise, you will hold that nasalization light if it happens to not be one of those 5 letters. Saw, bod, ba, wa, and qaf. On to some common mistakes. People sometimes, when they're learning this stuff, they overdo the tafkhim. They tend to um, learn and basically try to pronounce tafkhim or make letters tafkhim on letters, even when the letters don't have that characteristic. One brother, he started doing tafkhim on everything just to try to beautify his recitation. But the problem is, no, you should only be doing tafkhim on the letters that have that characteristic. Not every letter deserves to be heavy. Not every letter has that characteristic. If you overdo it, that's a mistake. Doing tafkhim on connected letters also happens to be a common mistake, which is that if you are connecting one letter to the next and the next letter happens to be heavy, then sometimes people happen to make the tafkhim on the connected letter as well. One of the common mistakes that I made is that people say Allah, which is incorrect. The hamza, that hamza is not heavy. It's Allah, not Allah, but Allah. That hamza is light. The lam is heavy. The lam is heavy because it's conditionally heavy. We talked about that, the rules related to lam. But the hamza is not. Same thing, there happens that comes a heavy letter, then a light letter, or a heavy letter is sandwiched in between two light letters. Light, heavy, light. That becomes very difficult for beginners to pronounce. So I'm going to assign exercises to you that is going to make you do tafkhim properly and make sure that you don't do tafkhim where it shouldn't be done and you do tafkhim where it should be done. And finally, the failing to do conditional tafkhim, there are so many rules that we learned today. There are rules on the letter lam, on the letter ra, on the mad sound, on the noon sound. All of those conditionals, if you fail to do tafkhim on them, that's a mistake, and this is a very common mistake for beginners. But we're going to overcome them slowly but surely. But remember, like I said at the beginning, this is not an easy thing by any measure. On to some exercises. I want you to recite a surah to someone and ask them to focus on your Tafkheem and Tarqeeq. Make it a surah that you already have memorized. The reason I'm making you do this with a surah that you have memorized is so that you don't have to worry about reading and keeping track of these rules as well. If it's a surah that you already know, for example, if you should already know Surah Al-Fatiha, then if you're only focusing on the Tafkheem and Tarqeeq rules, then technically you will have your mental model for knowing the surah will already be there. You can just focus on making sure that your tafkhim and tarqiq is correct. So recite a surah to someone, a surah that you already have memorized, and ask them to focus on your tafkhim and tarqiq rules. And if you are making any mistake in any of those rules, ask them to correct you. Another exercise is find a page in the Quran. You're going to do this with someone, recite to someone, and every time you recite a verse in the Quran, go back and point out to the rule to the person listening. For example, this ra is heavy because of this. This lam is light because of this. This mad is heavy because of this XYZ. All the rules that you have seen in this video, you're going to point out and the reason for them. And finally, elongation exercise. I will give you examples of holding the tafkhim in your mouth so that you have this. And basically, we've been doing this with the warm-ups as well. So in conclusion, we learned Tafkhim and Tarqiq today. I'm going to continue with some exercise videos. After the exercise videos related to Tafkhim and Tarqiq, I will do the final Qaida Nuraniya video recording. Then I will finish off with all the Surah Al-Kahf videos that I've been doing. Then, after I finish that, then it will be time for us to part ways. When I began this channel, I actually did not know if I was going to be able to complete all the videos that I wanted to record, but I will part ways with you because at that point, I will give you some pointers on how to continue your studies. But I will have taken you as far as I can take you. In videos, there really is only so much knowledge you can impart. But from that moment onward, you need to continue reciting to someone and you need to continue learning on your own. And I will record a final video in which I will explain how and why I did everything. So, Jazakallah khair for watching. If you like this video, please leave a like, comment on the video, subscribe to my channel, and share this knowledge with others to share in the hasanat and help me spread this knowledge. Jazakallah khair for watching. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi